So for this week, we're on chapter 1, Mishnah 2. Um, the we'll read first the Mishnah and then we'll break it down. So Mishnah 2 reads as follows: Shimon the righteous was one of the last of the men of the great assembly. He used to say, "The world stands upon three things: the Torah, the service, and acts of piety." Um, So before we begin the message itself that Rabbi Shimon HaTzaddik is teaching, let's learn a little bit of who Rabbi Shimon HaTzaddik is, and maybe through that we'll understand a little bit more of what the message is and why this is the message that the Rabbi Shimon HaTzaddik is sharing. So, if you were in that last week's class, the first Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, kind of gave us a little bit of a timetable on how the Torah tradition was passed on um, through generations by segments of people. The last of that segment we had, or to go to the beginning, you had Moshe to Yeshua, Yeshua to the prophets, the prophets to the elders to the prophets, um, and the prophets to the Great Assembly. So the Great Assembly were the rabbis which were led the Jewish people into the land of Israel. And they pretty much were the Knesset Hagdolah pretty much encompasses the rabbis that led the Jewish people back into Israel um, for quite a while during the Temple era. Shimon HaTzaddik was actually a Kohen Gadol. He was a high priest, and during his time, there was let me move back a second. During his time, there was a lot of great stories, but I just want to also mention something here. The Mishnah now is going to take individuals from Shimon HaTzaddik, and then we'll continue on to almost like we'll mention different rabbis, and in certain parts you even see where it goes from teacher to student, and then their student to their student, showing you kind of how throughout each generation the messages that were shared of ethics. So you might notice within Talmud, there's different ways that someone is referred to. Sometimes a person is referred to by name, like Shimon. Sometimes a person is referred to as Rabbi Shimon, right? Or various titles that can be used. As you'll, the earlier rabbis and the higher caliber they are, you'll notice they don't have titles. Where in our generations, we're very specific on making sure we call someone rabbi or introduce someone with their title. The earlier days, let's take for example even Moshe Rabbeinu, right? He's not called Rabbi Moshe or the great Moses. He's called as Moshe. Everyone knows him as Moses, right? And Shimon HaTzaddik as well, he's referred to as Shimon the righteous. And we call him by name without any surnames or titles. So the rabbis actually point out that people of greater stature need less titles. There's certain people that are so great that their name speaks for themselves. You don't need any other context in order to know that there's someone special. So Moshe, nobody needs to explain that Moshe the prophet or rabbi, that he was a rabbi or he was a leader, that he was a king or you don't need to add any titles because his name was so great that his name stands for itself. It's in later generations where people were lesser known or weren't of as great stature, which it's important to include the titles around them so that they have the respect that's appropriate with that. So that's just a interesting note on the way people's names are listed within Judaism. It's not an act of disrespect when someone's title is lacking. It's actually a sign of great stature and of great honor of that person. So now about Shimon HaTzaddik specifically. Shimon HaTzaddik was a high priest for about 40 years during the Second Temple era, which is very unique because not a lot of just in general leadership for 40 years back in those days meant that he led a healthy life And as well, the task of the high priest or the task in the temple was a very burdensome task on one's health. You would, whether it was winter or summer, the high priests and the priests would walk around barefoot with only the garments that are allowed to be used during service. So they wouldn't wear a winter coat or any sweaters or anything additional during the winter. And during the summer, they didn't exactly have that special summer clothes. And they were walking barefoot regardless of the weather conditions. So it wasn't the longevity of a priest or a high priest wasn't necessarily that, the normal for someone to live, especially those days with the medical of resources they had available. To be a leader for 40 years was quite a feat. And he was a Kohen Gadol for 40 years, and during his time was a very, I don't know if the word is blissful, but it was a very special time for the Jewish people. There were certain things that would happen, which were signs of blessing for the Jewish people, that happened constantly throughout Shimon HaTzaddik. Now, just to give a little example of who Shimon HaTzaddik was. So Shimon HaTzaddik lived a little bit before the story of Hanukkah. Um, he lived during the time of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, when he conquered Israel, Shimon HaTzaddik, as a kind of a honorable act to honor Alexander the Great, that was now the conqueror of Israel, and to help keep the relations that the Jewish people would be able to maintain practice of Judaism, he went out with a delegation of Jews to greet Alexander the Great, and he wore, as you see in the picture, he wore his garments that he would wear while serving in the temple. And as soon as he came out and Alexander the Great saw Shimon HaTzaddik, he jumped off his horse and bowed to Shimon HaTzaddik. And when people asked what's going on, why are you showing this great respect? Alexander the Great said, whenever I go to war, I've always saw an image of a fellow dressed in these these garbs. And whenever I see that, I know it's a sign that I'm going to be successful. And Shimon HaTzaddik came out. He said, "This is the image that I see every time I go to battle." And that resulted in an unbelievable relationship between Shimon HaTzaddik and Alexander the Great. And during Alexander the Great's rule of Jerusalem, the Jewish people were allowed to practice their religion, live in peace, and lived under very good conditions. It was after his passing and in later generations when Antiochus came to power is when things started changing, which eventually led to the Hanukkah story. But that's just a little bit about the greatness of Shimon HaTzaddik. To what I was saying before, so one of the things, for example, during his time as Kohen Gadol, in the menorah, the most western light of the menorah would burn the entire 24 hours, even though all candles were given the same amount of oil. The western light would continue to burn so that there was a light always burning on the menorah. On Yom Kippur, for example, on Yom Kippur itself, so it's considered a good sign when one of the services on Yom Kippur is you draw lots over two goats. One goat is brought as a sacrifice, and the other one is sent to be thrown off a cliff as an atonement for the Jewish people. So if the right hand pulls out the lot for the sacrifice and the left hand for the azazel, that for the cliff, it's considered a good sign. And during Shimon HaTzaddik's during his reign as Kohen Gadol, every single time he drew the lot, it would come out in the same hand. As well, part of the Azazel sacrifice, they would take a red string, and wrap it around the door, the horns of the goat, and they would also, I'm not sure how they did it in the second temple because it wasn't exactly doors, but they would tie a string in by the Holy of Holies, and after the goat was cast off the mountain, if the white string would according to tradition would turn to white, and that would be a sign of atonement. There were some years that it wouldn't, but years which God, was sign where the Jewish people were fully atoned that year would be that the string would turn to white. And during Reb Shimon's time as Kohen Gadol, the string always turned white. There are other miracles that happened during his time, but gives you a gist of the specialty of his reign as Kohen Gadol and his presence as a leader for the Jewish people. What we take away from here, though, and which will play in over here, we use the terminology always, he used to say, Hu Haya Omer. What does it mean he used to say? It's not, I'm sure there's other things that he used to say as well. And it's not the only message that he shared, but this was something that very much connected with his, with which was very, which was commonly associated or had a very strong meaning to who he was as well. So when you think of Shimon HaTzaddik, what is a message of life that personifies, or you would automatically associate with Shimon HaTzaddik from the teachings? He would say this is what it would be. So before we go break down what it was, an element of Shimon HaTzaddik was that fell within the Jewish community was the idea of consistency. So over here as well, we're going to see Shimon HaTzaddik is going to teach us a importance of consistency in our service of God. I'll come back to this maybe at the end, but that's going to be a message which he's going to follow through. The importance while serving God, not necessarily to give over focus on one element of service over others, but there should be a consistency, which goes into what he talks about, that there's three things which the world stands. And his point over here is that in all three things, we need to put our focus. We can't justify one over the other, because if you have a chair and if you have a tripod and you start pushing one too higher than the other, you're not going to have an even balance at the top. So you need to have a balanced tripod or a balanced chair. The legs of a chair have to be balanced, otherwise it's going to be wobbly. So over here too, when we're doing our service in God, when we categorize what the three main focuses of our service is, we have to make sure that they're all holding us up in a balanced form. Another element of his messaging, that the world stands on three things, and this perhaps is shown by his interaction with Alexander the Great, is that the world, where it was a time where for the Jewish people was a very nerve-wracking thing, and then Alexander the Great said, actually, what inspires me is the Jewish people, is the Shimon HaTzaddik. Is another thing is, if the world stands upon the three pillars of service of God, then anything that happens in this world can't be a challenge to our service in God. If the pillars of the world, what makes the world tick, is our service and our relationship with God, then if something seems to contradict us being able to, then that's what's out of place in this world, not what we need to accomplish. What's interesting is, I just want to cross-reference a little bit. Over here, Shimon HaTzaddik speaks about three things on which the world stands. There's going to be a Mishnah later in Pirkei Avot, which is going to say on three things the world exists. And the question is, what is the difference between these two Mishnahs? And over there, it speaks about three different things. So I think what's important to stress over here is there's three things, which is the reason why the world exists. And that's what he's going to talk about over here. What are the reasons why the world stands? Is because of these three things. In the Mishnah later, it's going to talk about what are three things that maintain the world. So, for example, what are the three things that you want out of your house, right? So you're going to say, I want a place that I can learn, I want a place that I could cook, and I want a place that I can sleep. Let's say, for example. So those are the three things you want your house to be able to do. However, in order for that to happen, what are the three things to help your house for that to happen? So you may need to have a foundation on your house, you may need to have lighting, right? So there are things which enable your wants, but then there's the three things in which you want out of it. So in this Mishnah, we're focusing the three things which we need, which make the world stand, which are the reasons why the world is created and what helps the world, and the reasons why the world continues to exist. Later in another Mishnah, we'll speak about three things which enable this to facilitate that ability, three important things which have to be in order to facilitate what it is that we want from the world. So, what are the three things that that Shimon HaTzaddik says? So, the first thing is it stands on the Torah. I don't think we need to elaborate what Torah is. I think we all know what Torah is. But we see this in there's a verse. I should have maybe put it on here, but I didn't. But there's a verse that's Ko Amar Hashem im lo verisi yamim v'layla chukas shemayim ba'aretz lo samti. God says, if not for my covenant, if not for my covenant day and night, the laws of heaven and earth I would not have placed. So what is this covenant with day and night that it's referring to? So the Midrash over there explains that this is referring to the Jewish people accepting the Torah. So al shlosha dvarim olam kayam, there's two lenses basically we could look at the Mishnah. One is, what were the pillars that allowed the world to stand? Is either Torah, Avot, Gemilas, Chasadim. There's another way, is what continues the world to stand. So over here too, we could look at the Torah was either the acceptance of the Torah or the active fulfillment of study of Torah. It's a little fine line, but in each of these things, it's way we could translate them one of two ways. Either we're referring to what enabled the world, so it was either the acceptance of the Torah by the Jews, or what enables, which is our continued study of the Torah. So avoda is called service. So what is service? The basic element of service that will be referred to is always is the service of the temple. What was the service of the temple? The service of the temple was sacrifices. We can translate that same past verse that we said, if not for my covenant, there was the covenant of the Abraham and God by the bris bein absarim, the forgetting the English translation over here, but the covenant between the parts, where over there sacrifices were brought, and so we see that element as well, if not for those sacrifices. And we also saw this. This is true when Noah, after the flood, what brought about the rainbow, what brought about the promise that the world will continue to exist, was Noah bringing sacrifices. So we see how sacrifices also play in to the continuity of the world. Today, we don't have sacrifices. So what is it? So again, there's the element of what exists within the world, and then there's what we're actively doing to keep the world involved. So today we don't bring sacrifices. Instead, it's called there's a famous midrash and brought on halacha, Ezehu avoda, so avoda shebelev. What is service? Service of the heart, working on oneself, and that's done primarily during prayer. So we have Torah and prayer. Those are the two active elements that we do right now, which help the world continue to exist. And the third thing is acts of piety, gemilas chasadim. Where did we see an example in the Torah that acts of kindness or piety is connected with the continuity of the world? We saw this by Sodom. Sodom, God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. What was the sin that Sodom and Gomorrah did? So today in American, I don't know if the word is American, in culturally, very commonly, and I think also very a lot of non-Jewish scholars that claim to quote from the Torah will quote Sodom and Gomorrah to be more related to matters of immorality, related to marriage or and something like that. But in Judaism, the understanding of the ethics via the of where the breakdown of ethics in Sodom and Gomorrah came from was a lack of care for one another. There was a complete breakdown of kindness. For example, why did Lot's wife turn into a pillar of salt? Because she didn't have salt in her home and she had to go to guests' houses. And in guest houses, people wouldn't actually share. There was no concept of sharing. And by going to guest houses, she basically advertised the fact that she had guests. And guests were something which you didn't do in Sodom. You didn't take care of other people, which that led to the whole story where people came charging on the house, trying to pull the people out and get rid of them. It was in a you could see a little bit of the similarity also within Roman culture where you were defined by your class. If you were a poor person, you were a poor person. There was no sense of kindness. If you were rich, then God blessed you to be rich. The gods blessed you to be rich. And if you were poor, then the gods deemed you to be poor, and there was no need of caring for another. So we saw by Sodom, God destroyed the city because they didn't have that sense of kindness. So we also see where kindness is a condition of continuity in the world. Now, if you notice over here, it doesn't say acts of charity, it says acts of piety or acts of kindness. Why is that? Because kindness is not restricted to physically giving money to someone else. The need to be kind, anybody can do. Regardless of your social economic status, you're able to be kind. You can be kind by being gentle, by being gracious, by words of kindness, by visiting the sick, right? By taking care of the needy, by volunteering. It's not necessarily an act of charity. Charity would limit acts of kindness to only people which have money that they can share. By stressing acts of kindness, it's a stress that every single person can be the act. Every single person has the ability to participate, and not and shouldn't write themselves out of, oh, I don't have the ability to do gamilas chasadim, I can't be kind. It's not true. Everybody has that ability to be kind. Now, all right, any questions so far? All right. So over here, I'll just wrap things up and do a little bit of a breakdown of different ways of how you can interpret the three pillars of the world. So the way we explained it right now, on the very basic level, Torah refers to the study of Torah and the acceptance of Torah. Avoda refers to sacrifices or prayer nowadays, and Gemilas Chasadim would be kind deeds. Now, there's also you can take these three categories and see them as a general three categories of all types of observance of God. And we stressed this last week also, which again, the importance of ethics of our Father, is the idea of character building as part of religion. So Torah is the study of Torah. So you have the mitzvah of Torah, which is studying, which engages more our mind. Then you have avoda, service, which is an action. So any form of action of God, which is observance of God's commandments. So you have the study of Torah, then there's the observance of the commandments. And then you have gemilas chasadim, which is kindness, comes from positive character, right? So it's a sign of character building. So all three parts are pillars that help the world exist. You can't have one without the other. So it's easy sometimes to say, oh, I'm a bright guy, I'm going to study Torah, or I'm a kind person, I'll focus on being kind with my emotions, or I'm a man of action, I'm just going to follow the commandments. So over here, they're all three pillars. One has to possess, we need to have all three of them in our service of God. The study of Torah, observance of mitzvot, and observance of character. There's another element over here. which is the goals of, sort of say, we want to have through our in our miniature world, the things that we want to accomplish spiritually. So this is a little bit of a finer thing, and I'm going to contrast that with the opposite. So the when someone is engaged in spirituality, so this is the three things which you'll want, which are signs, or hopefully one accomplishes through that. The first thing is when one to study a Torah, which is more of a you're studying what's beyond you, is should hopefully as well in our observance of God, we transcend our desires. Man by default has a lot of physical desires. When we engage in Torah, when we engage in service of God, our first goal is to overcome those desires. We don't become bowed down and we don't indulge in our physical desires. The second thing, which we hopefully have as well, we build a relationship with God. God is not just something that exists or we know of, but it becomes personal. And that's something which takes work, which we need to work on. That's avoda. And as well, we desire interaction with other people, interpersonal relations. We desire healthy relationships with others. Now, this is an exact contrast to what we saw the people that were undeserving of existence. We're talking about the world in existence. When God destroyed the world, which was by the great flood, the people at the time represented the worst of all these three things. First thing is, in the generation of the Torah of Noach, what were the three sins that they had? Adultery, idolatry, and murder. Adultery is the ultimate example in the Torah of someone succumbing to their desires. So the first thing of what we want to avoid is succumbing to desire. So that was the first thing that the people in the generation of the flood did. The second thing was idolatry, which is an act of not of a denial of God and actively denying God's existence. And the third thing is murder, which is a sign to the extreme of a lack of sensitivity of the other person, complete lack of sensitivity of the other person. So on the contrast, when one engages in Torah, when God engages in the service of God and engages in Gemilas Chasadim, what we're hopefully is being able to transcend our physical desires, have a healthy relationship with God, and also be there and genuinely care for another person in any way, which form. Another one of the commentaries point out, which is just an interesting thing, that you could also find a connection to the three patriarchs of the Jewish people to these three services of God. Yaakov was known as a Yoshev Oel. He sat in the tent, whereas his brother Esav was out in the field hunting. He was a Torah scholar. Isaac was brought himself as a sacrifice. And Abraham was known till today for his kindness. He had a tent open to all four sides. He was the epitome of kindness. So the pillars of the Jewish people also represent the pillars that hold the world together. Now, this will be more interesting if you're familiar with the first Mishnah, but one of the commentaries point out you could also connect the three things the three messages that help endure Torah study that the great sages of the Great Assembly said are also alluded to in the three pillars. The first, what were the three things? To establish students, to protect the performance of mitzvahs, make safeguards, and the first one was being patient with others. So establishing many students, that's enhancing Torah study. Protecting the performance of mitzvos is connected with action, which is avoda, and being patient with others is a message for interpersonal, which is connected with gemilas chasadim. So you also see how these three pillars are subtly intertwined with the three stages of protecting the transmission of Torah to the next generation. Which this leaves off with a very interesting thing is the number. What's the common denominator about all these threes is that we're dealing with threes. There's three pillars. There's three forefathers, right? There's three categories of how you break down mitzvot. And if you're familiar with Judaism, the Torah itself is broken down into three books. You have the Torah, the prophets, and the scriptures. The Torah itself was given in the third month from when the Jewish people left Israel. The number three has a very big significance in Judaism. And one of the big reasons for that is because the number three is representation of balance. You have Mr. One, you have Mr. Two, and then number three comes and brings them together into one number. So, or is the mediator that brings them together. So number three is a sign of peace and wholesomeness, and kind of going in over here, as Shimon HaTzaddik is saying, which is stressing the need for balance. Torah is very into having healthy balance, and the number three, which is unity, is a big part in a very underlying message throughout Torah in general. And that wraps up our Mishnah too, and we'll continue, God willing, next week.